Welcome to the Peep Show podcast.
Your glance at sex and social justice.
With Jesse and PJ Sage. Hello everyone, we are happy to be back with another episode. This week we are bringing you coverage from Theorizing the Web, an annual conference in New York that focuses on social issues in digital technology. In this episode, we will talk to 3 Theorizing the Web participants. We will bring you an interview with Kelly Steinmetz, who will talk to us about sex emojis. Then we will talk to Mattie Brice about being a trans woman on dating sites. And lastly, we will talk to Lindsay Ferris about how women are queering their tech up, especially in the world of internet dating. But first, PJ and I will talk about our experiences this year at the conference. We are driving home from New York. We're actually literally driving, so pardon the road noise if it gets a little noisy. But we were at this conference this weekend, and we were talking a bit about it on the way home and thought that we would share our reflections with you. To put our cards on the table, Theorizing the Web is a conference that PJ and his colleagues started 8 years ago, and so it's kind of a family tradition for us to go up there. Relevant to our audience and to the work that we do, we should say that you've organized panels of sex workers too, and online sex workers who've talked about their relationship to the internet.
Yeah, and particularly in 2014, we invited Melissa Jarrett-Grant to join us and to help organize a panel of sex workers who included Stoya and some other folks to talk about issues in the industry. But there's always been like a thread of talking about sex work, and often we'll have 1 or 2 sex workers submit presentations for the conference.
Yeah, so because that's actually always been like such a part of the conference, I think that both of us kind of assumed that talking about the internet at this conference in a way that's very social justice oriented would also mean that a lot of the discussions would revolve around the things that are happening with our community right now with FOSTA and SESTA.
Yeah, actually, I was kind of shocked how little those issues came up.
Well, yeah, it's super interesting. So when we're at a conference talking about theorizing the web, and in the last several weeks, you've had Craigslist Personal shut down, Backpage shut down, Pounce.org. I'm trying to think. There's Tur, the erotic review.
Eros was raided a few months ago.
Yeah, like massive shutdowns. There's also rumors that FetLife is going to be shut down. So when an entire population of people is getting massively silenced and their platforms that they work on and how they make a living are being shut down, not to mention the fact that even on platforms that aren't getting shut down like Twitter, the people who are doing sex work on Twitter are getting like shadow banned without being told that they're being shadow banned. When this is happening on such like a massive scale and totally impacting the communities that we are a part of to such a large degree, it was really striking to sit for 2 days and have people talk about the social implications of the internet without mentioning it.
I felt like almost every panel I went to, there was a number of relevant conversations that really could have been connected into these issues, but just those connections weren't being made. And I think it just made, actually, despite the fact that I helped start the conference, there was a way in which I felt kind of invisible sitting in a room, myself feeling like my livelihood is under attack, that my friends are in a panic and fearing that they're going to be arrested, fearing that the next tech conference that we go to, which is AIR in Canada, that we're not going to be able to cross the border because we already know we're flagged, because last time we crossed the border, they looked through our social media.
Yeah, that was actually so striking to me because we have been detained at the border and our social media has been gone over. And there was a whole keynote address where people were talking about face recognition software in air flight and at border checks. And we're talking about what all of the possible negative consequences could be in some like dystopian future when actually that's already our present. And that wasn't being brought up.
We're living the dystopian future that they're imagining. So, here's the thing about FOSTA SESTA, though. I understand, like, sex workers are not the only marginalized group, and there are lots of other people coming from lots of different backgrounds or positionalities who certainly merit a lot of attention, and that we should be talking about, the trouble that they're having. But that being said, we are at a historical moment when the actual piece of legislation that was just passed, the first instance where the protections of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and for the first time saying they're going to hold platforms liable for what people are posting on their sites. And that basically is forcing platforms to start silencing and censoring certain kinds of communication. And who are the first targets of this kind of rollback or repression? The answer is it's sex workers, right? Right now, sex workers are the population that is most under attack explicitly by legislation that's being pushed through the government. And I think it's interesting, actually, going back to 2014, which is the year that we did the keynote panel specifically on online sex work. Another sex worker who was there, Maggie Mayhem, who gave a separate presentation, her thesis was that sex workers are the canaries in the coal mine when it comes to internet freedom. And I think that looking back 4 years ago, what Maggie said was prescient. That what we're seeing, it turns out that sex workers are, in fact, the first class of people to lose protections on the internet.
Yeah, and I mean, Twitter, even for people like myself, who the work that we do isn't illegal and nothing that we post on Twitter violates their terms of service. Like, you can actually have nudity and you can talk about what you want to talk about on Twitter. Super interesting that even when you're not violating any of their terms of service or anything, they're massively silencing sex workers, disproportionate to other groups.
I don't know, but as far as I can tell, it seems to be that one of the chief goals of instituting shadow banning, which also wasn't brought up ever apart from us, is to silence sex workers. I mean, I think it's also to go after bots, but a chief target of shadow banning has been sex workers. And we're seeing now this is also the case on Instagram with the new auto-delete feature or policy that they have, that so many sex workers are just having their posts instantaneously and automatically deleted, even if they don't technically violate any terms of service. I mean, I would have loved to see the conference talk about that as well.
I think that's all totally related. So when we're living in a world in which this is so important and on the mind of so many people, and basically actually all anyone can talk about, those conversations aren't getting outside of our community at all, to the point that leaders in the tech industry, it's not even on their radar. And it doesn't seem like a coincidence that it's not getting outside of our community because none of us have a voice. We're all shadow banned.
All of that to say, I guess this is the important point, is that for us, these conversations and these issues aren't like meta, right? They're not academic. When we talk about erasure from the public sphere, we're not only talking about this in some abstract sense. We're like, hey, literally, we can't participate in this conference that we're at fully because we're being erased by the technologies that you're theorizing at this conference. Please help. And I mean, for the most part, honestly, I felt like that fell on deaf ears. Yeah. And I know most of these people, and they are good-hearted people, and they're committed to social justice. And I don't know. I mean, honestly, part of it, I feel like, is our fault. Obviously, we're the people who are best positioned to talk about these issues. We knew about these issues going into the event. We could have said, hey, even though the program was set prior to the passage of FOSTA SESTA, which was rushed through and happened almost overnight. But we could have said, hey, this is like an emergency. We really need to make some space to talk about these issues.
Yeah, but the thing about that is that we were kind of blindsided in the sense that we would have done that if we thought that it wasn't on anyone's radar, but it was like shocking to us that it wasn't.
Yeah, which is true. But I guess maybe we should have checked in and taken the temperature on things. I think our fear, honestly, was that talking about this stuff too much with a tech audience would be redundant, that we would be wasting too much time with like a basic explainer on FOSTA SESTA or something. I mean, the truth is like, it's not just like it was sex workers who were pushing against this. I mean, the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is like a tech civil liberties organization, was one of the main groups that was fighting against the passage of FOSTA SESTA. They actually helped the sex work community organize and build a website to contact local legislatures because, you know, they had the skills to do that. So there were activists within the tech community who were working on these things. It just seems like there were a few of them, and that somehow this conversation hasn't circulated out to the broader tech community. And I can tell you, if it's not circulating out to the broader tech community, it sure as hell isn't making its way to the legislatures.
Yeah, I left a little disheartened, feeling like this is something that weighs so heavily on people that I care so much about, and that these things aren't even on the people's radar who are creating an entire community to talk about ethical and social and structural issues with the internet. And so I think that what PJ is saying is exactly right. If the progressive people who are really interested in social justice issues vis-a-vis the internet aren't even thinking about this, then nobody is really thinking about us except for us. I feel responsible. I feel like I kind of let my community down by being at a internet theory conference in which I didn't make sure that this is being represented. And I don't know. I guess all we can do from here is, it was a wake-up call. I should say that. I should say it was a big wake-up call because I didn't realize how not on the radar this is for people. And I feel like now we really do need to make sure that people outside of our own community, outside of our own echo chamber, are talking about this and are realizing how important this is.
And I'm not blaming. You know, I don't want to come off as casting blame. I mean, the truth is that I blame myself. We're, you know, and particularly me, are the crossover figures. You know, there are some people, but there's not like that many people who are well-positioned, who have a foot and a platform and a voice in both communities, like the sex work community and the tech community. And the handful of us who do and who have the privilege and position and platform to speak, I mean, the impetus is on us to be the translators or bridge figures, or to reach the ears of people who might actually make a difference and could get some of these things changed.
On that note, we will move on to our interviews.
So we're here today with Kelly Jasmine Steinmetz. She's a film, culture, and media scholar based in New York City. She's also a filmmaker and food culture enthusiast. And even though this isn't in her bio, we know she loves Cher.
I do.
Well, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
Yeah, so we were at your Theorizing the Web talk and thought it was really great. In particular, as online sex workers, who both of us are, we're really interested in how bodies are expressed and represented online. And so the focus of your talk was on emojis and sort of the way that like sex and bodies are expressed through emojis. So do you want to talk about what attracted you to emojis and the peach emoji in particular as a thing to talk about?
So my talk was called Do I Dare to Meme a Peach? Mimesis and Subversion. So like I'm interested in the peach emoji in particular as a site that I think uniquely shows first how bodies become rendered on the internet in a certain kind of legible way for many people, but then also like how that legibility could be subverted once it is out in the world and being used and circulated. So like I was interested with the peach emoji, how it became so universally understood as a butt or even just a female body or something in a sex relationship. And then I was interested in how Kim Kardashian really made it her own and doubled down on this interpretation of the peach emoji. And then how once that movie Call Me By Your Name came out and we had our peach scene, we had a new way to see the peach emoji and maybe a new, more queer understanding that isn't only about representing a body in like a one-to-one kind of graphic relationship, but also about a kind of expression of love or fantasy.
I'm actually not much of an emoji user, I think because I'm so old, but I started to see that because I'm somebody who has a great big butt, and people started sending me like peach emojis when they were talking to me, and I was like, what is this?
Why do you keep peaching me?
I don't even know what this is. And then suddenly I was like, I think this has something to do with my butt. So,
and then you were flattered because it meant analogical association with Kim Kardashian.
Yeah, I didn't even know that. Like, I didn't know it had anything to do with Kim Kardashian until your talk. So,
so let's unpack all of this, though. Let's start off with the representations of sexed bodies. So one of the interesting things you brought up is how there are bathrooms now that use the peach and the eggplant emoji as like the male and female sign.
Yeah, so when I was looking through Instagram in preparation for this talk and like really trying to see like how this is used in the wild, you could hashtag an emoji, which I also learned for the first time.
I didn't know that.
Hashtag peach, just like a single one. There was a few different posts.
Just so you know, I just total aside, I hashtag your butt on Instagram all the time with the peach emoji.
What?
It's
for our porn account.
Real.
I totally never noticed that.
Yeah, I do.
Wow.
Because it's one of the top choices. You go to like Bootylicious, and then it's Bootylicious Peach, and then it's just Peach. The technology encourages you to do that, actually.
This is why you run our Instagram account. No, I didn't even know that. That's so interesting.
But we'll leave our little porn empire out of this.
Well, I think it's definitely in dialogue with this, right? So I came across a post that was gendered bathroom markers. So like the eggplant was the men's bathroom, like a neon sign with an eggplant emoji. And then the peach emoji was the women's. So like I'm interested in how it's not only that the peach is a butt, but it seems to be very female or very heteronormative. Like we have the peach and we have the eggplant, and that is our binary emoji relationship.
Right. And like the peach could be a vagina too, right? Like usually it's a butt, but it could also be a vagina.
And then in like more queer spaces, from the people who I've spoken to, I don't exist online in queer spaces very much or very often. So I don't want to speak too much to a community I'm not actively a part of. But from the people I've spoken to, it could also signal bottom or just like the non-phallus part of
Oh, really? So, that's interesting too.
But I still think that that's part of the same hegemonic use of it is like the non-phallus, and it is part of a heteronormative sort of structure where there's still like a phallus in play.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder, so do people use it on like Grindr to like signal?
Like this is what I've heard, but I can't speak to that as much. But
yeah, sure. Like without
being on Grindr.
Yeah, or like claiming expertise that none of us have. But I guess I can see how that could be used to signal bottom or like the kind of sex that you're interested, even if it's being transposed into a gay male context.
Yeah. So there's a kind of beckoning sexualization to the peach that's like, I'm here for you, phallus. That I think that's what we want to get away from, maybe.
Okay, so let's talk about getting away from that. Call Me By Your Name, I think, is this.
It was a game changer for the peach emoji.
So what is that?
You're not familiar?
The film?
No.
You know how I know about the film, and I'm embarrassed to admit it. But
what?
It's our older son, I think, read the book.
Oh, really?
Apparently, it's very saucy.
The book is amazing. I also recommend the audiobook, which Armie Hammer reads to you in seductive tones. It's kind of like an academic adjacent sort of gay fantasy coming of age story.
Oh.
Which I guess for like the listeners who don't know. So there's like a young-ish boy, I think he's about 17, named Elio, and then he falls for his father, who's a professor, like his new teaching assistant named Oliver. And then there's a scene in the film after they've like hooked up once, but then there's a scene in the film where Elio's kind of fantasizing about Oliver. and they're in like the Italian countryside, and he like takes a peach from a tree and he masturbates with the peach, and then all of the peach that's like filled with his cum. So that's kind of an interesting scene. And
I know, that's what I'm saying, saucy.
Saucy.
I don't remember this.
Well, I don't know if he read it or if it's just sort of a thing that queer kids in high school are talking about because it's, you know, sort of culturally whatever permeating down. But I've definitely heard
about this.
The kids is talking about it.
Anyway, but then like when the movie's being talked about online or even in the kind of fandoms of the actors, there's a lot of peach emojis circulating. And in that case, the peach emoji doesn't really stand in for a butt in the same way. It's standing in for, in my view, a kind of excitement or love, affection, fantasy, all those things. And I think that that is really interesting because it's showing that the emoji is kind of malleable.
Right. The peach no longer just represents like a body part, but now it represents this scene or this thing in our cultural imagination. But
Exactly.
that, in turn, that movie, that scene is then representative of something bigger, which is a more queer sexuality or like a less rote, prescribed, heteronormative sexuality.
Or like less one-to-one, like you said.
Yeah.
It's something
like
that's like
imaginative.
more expansive. And
Exactly. And I think like what the Kimoji is doing is trying to make it like less ephemeral and trying to double down more on the butts, round butts, kind of heteronormative sex, certain body ideals, those things. But like I love Kim Kardashian, so I'm still conflicted like when I say these things.
I actually love her too.
But I think that what the Kimoji is doing is it's saying, like, you already are thinking about this way. I'm going to make you think about it more that way and associate it more to me as this queen, the meme and emoji world.
And perhaps of the butt as well.
Yeah.
But
the butt, like the butt-centric brand.
Right, exactly, the butt-centric brand. And I guess just maybe for listeners who haven't seen the Kimoji version of the peach, it's like a very round peach with cream dripping down the top of it.
Yeah.
The picture that you showed is her in a thong or in like a bodysuit, but it mimics the cream on the peach, and so it doubles down on the allusion to a butt and to sexuality by, I don't know, just visualizing the peach in the most exaggerated way that can make you think sex.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But again, it's like a very heteronormative sex.
Yeah. So I guess that's kind of the, like, not issue necessarily, but like something that I think we should note about the emojis is that when you go through them, they're all very much like about sex, and that's totally cool. But I think what's interesting is like when you're more creatively using the regular emoji keyboard, that firstly, you don't have to pay or go through some, sponsored wall to get. But when you're using quote unquote regular emojis in kind of creative or poetic ways, I think that that's the interesting thing that we could do, because we could imagine better fantasy or like allow for more space of expression that isn't as foreclosed into like a heteronormative framework.
Well, and that brings kind of a power analysis into it too. It's like who gets to decide the designs of our emojis. If it's specific corporations or specific celebrities, then like what we're going to get is ultimately their take on sex or sexuality or bodies.
Or even like what's attractive.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All of it.
As a person not attracted to emojis, I use like 2 hearts.
That's my mom's favorite.
That's the extent of my emoji use.
Yeah, well, you're also a phone sex operator. I mean, like, you're just very like inclined to audio
and language.
And language as a medium, as opposed to visual media.
Yeah.
So, I mean, part of that, I think, just comes down to personal preference, right? Like,
yeah. So I guess the question that I'm asking is, how do people that aren't me engage in emojis? Because I think I kind of tune them out. I don't even really know. Like when you say, well, these are the reasons that we as a culture or whatever are attracted to emojis, I'm actually really curious what that is.
Me too.
Like what attracts us to emojis?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think there's something to be said for this mimetic idea where it's like if you just wrote peach as a caption to an Instagram picture where you're like working out or something like that. It wouldn't have the same effect as if you have that kind of like visual marker.
Which is actually really interesting because when I was in my graduate program, my advisor, when he would send me emails, would use emojis, but he would use them not as emojis. Like he would write a sentence and then put in parentheses, smile, like written out. And
that's interesting.
And I thought that was really interesting.
I think that's also like an accessibility thing, but I'm not sure if that's why.
I mean, there is certainly pre-emoji, right? Like we can go back to like the 90s and the 80s, and
there was a whole time before emoji.
There was a time before emoji when back in AOL chat rooms and stuff where people would put asterisks around different expressions or actions or emotes, emotional expressions, as a way of conveying something visual or something more complex that you didn't necessarily want to write out in 2 sentences. Part of it maybe is that emojis allow for a degree of abbreviation, especially when we start overlaying them with multiple meanings. But I don't know. Also, I think it's just emotional. There's something about the smile that seeing the little smiley guy or woman somehow has like more emotional impact than just writing smile. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think for some people
See, here's what I think happens though. I think people use emojis to like undercut what they're saying or to soften like criticism. People will say like really aggressive things on text and then put like a smile.
Yeah, but people
emoji
do that in person
at the
too.
end of it.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a sort of tonal calibrating work that the emoji like can be doing, which sometimes is helpful for clarity and sometimes it's just adding more ambiguity. But I think that goes to sort of what I'm getting at, even like with the peach emoji, and that it is both specific, but it is also expansive in that it leaves a gray area, which could be positive in terms of imagining a more queer world or whatever, but could also be sort of negative maybe in being unclear or manipulative if it's in like one-to-one communication versus more social media.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. If it like takes on a different character in one-to-one communication than social media or something.
I think it does, but one will always inform the other. So it's not that they're like divorced, but it's different like adding it, I think, to the end of a sentence than having it kind of stand in place or express something that you're trying to reference.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the early uses of the emoji were because a lot of communication was heavily text-based, right, on the internet. This was a way to add another level of communication in. And I mean, it's hard to remember, but even like Facebook 7 years ago was a heavily text-based platform. Now it's very media saturated.
Yeah, and I think I'm like such in the minority because I hate that. This is why I don't like Instagram at all. I'm like, oh God, this is like really boring. And I want Twitter. I want there to be more conversations.
I don't understand your whole job.
I'm interested in listening to this as well. I wasn't expecting that.
You peddle smut. you make GIFs of your body for a living.
Yeah, but that's not what I want to consume. It's not.
And I think, like, to your point also, is I think like after Facebook was so bothered by its position in the last election and the way that it sort of enabled certain like alt-right discourse and like memes in particular. So there are certain filters now where it's like, I think they don't allow certain memes to be posted. I have to do more research, but basically it's like they want you to have like videos more instead of still images of memes. Apparently like videos are not as damaging versus just like maybe to circulate certain like ideologies. But then to upend the censors, people will put just like a still image, but as a video. So you have 10 seconds of like nothing moves or changes.
Oh, wow.
Right. Just to kind of go against the filter. So to your point, in terms of the more visual culture, I think it's also like moving more towards video and like moving images.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I suppose that also raises a question of emojis themselves are still like pretty static.
Even though the emoji is ostensibly static and that it's not a moving image, I think because we use emojis in such frequency and they're in such high circulation that they're constantly being reinscribed with new connotations. So they're static in the sense that they're not moving, but I don't think they're static in the sense that their meaning becomes.
Oh, yeah, right. No, that's a really good point. And I mean, I guess that's true with even static memes as well, but the movement is more in the exchange and the like new meanings that we attach to them as opposed to them actually being like a video themselves or something like that.
It's actually interesting, though, because I think that they're like a language that you have to learn.
Like emoji literacy.
Yeah, I think there is. Like, it took me a long time to figure out that the emoji that everybody used for, like, that's funny is funny and not crying. Like,
oh, like the one with the smiley with the tears kind of like sides, but in a more angled, sideways way.
Yeah. So
for the last 2 years, you thought you were making all of your friends miserable all of the time. You're like, why does everybody hate me?
No.
Yeah.
There's something that isn't intuitive to me about a lot of those.
And if you look at the names of them on the like Unicode website or whatever, it's even less intuitive. You're like, oh, I thought that meant something totally different. But that's because it has acquired its own meaning. And I guess that's what's both interesting and perplexing about emojis is they gain their meaning in circulation, which I guess one could say about all languages. But these, an Emojipedia or whatever don't really get at the nuance.
But bringing it back to sex, because I think it's relevant here, is it seems like there's something about communicating about sex, maybe because it's always like a little taboo, always a little bit against the rules. That it seems to me that the way we talk about sex or communicate about sex and the like changes, the slang that emerges, the like differing meanings that we assign to things, it seems like that happens more rapidly with sex than other things. Maybe it's also just because teenagers are always trying to come up with new ways to talk about sex in order to do it without their parents knowing what they're saying. But again, I think that has to do with it being somewhat forbidden or something. That it just seems that the circulation, the speed at which we reassign meaning to words and maybe emoji, with regards to sex is like much faster than other aspects of life.
I think that's probably accurate. And I think the sort of barrier to entry or that emoji literacy thing that you're speaking of is maybe what like young people in particular would capitalize on as saying like, this is how I could express myself, or like without it being as like immediately obvious as if someone picked up their phone and like read certain words or some kind of like sexting expression.
Yeah, I honestly didn't know until like a month ago that eggplants were phallic. Like I didn't I am being like really transparent in this interview for some reason. Like, I don't know how to connect to emojis. Like I really don't.
I mean, you must have recognized that they were phallic. Was it at the Hump Festival?
Yes.
There was this movie at the Hump Festival where they have sex with an egg.
I was like, what is happening? I'm actually a really tuned in person too, but for some reason, like emojis, I like really struggle with.
I like that it had to be that literal. Because that itself it's a perfect example of what you're talking about. It's the reverse. It's they literally made like a porn video using an eggplant, but clearly because they were referencing the emoji. They were enacting the emoji.
So that's like the inverse of Call Me By Your Name.
Right,
or something.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great, and also probably a great note to end on. Did you have anything else that we missed that you wanted to say?
No, this was great. I just wanted to say sapiotextual is the best Twitter handle I've ever seen in my life.
Oh, thank you.
That's the only thing I wanted to say.
All right, so where can people find you if they're interested in following your Twitter or learning more about your work?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Kelly Jasmine, KellyJasmine, and Instagram at the same place. And that's about it for now.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks so much for talking to us.
Thanks for having me. This was great.
We are here today with Mattie Brice. Mattie's an interdisciplinary critical maker applying design research and play to interpersonal politics concerning emotional labor systems and power in intimacies. She currently teaches at New York University, the New School, and the School of Visual Arts. So Mattie, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Tell our audience a little bit about what you were doing with your talk.
So the talk I gave at Theorizing the Web was called Catfishing in 3 Acts, and it was about talking about emotional labor networks, supporting masculinity in a way of like men testing out progressive identities through their experiences with trans women. And it was essentially a talk about the connections and patterns I found in my autoethnography of my experience on dating apps. And so I'm a game designer, or I come from game design. And so I look at these systems like dating apps and social media and things like that from the perspective of game design and through our sort of language.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, I tried to kind of understand like what is going on from that perspective. And I started to realize that people were gaming dating apps, and that dating apps, the design of dating apps kind of facilitated and encouraged certain behaviors.
I think a lot of our listeners will be familiar with catfishing, which you had mentioned, but probably a few won't. So before we talk about the specifics, do you think you can just give us like a very general definition of what catfishing is?
Yeah, I guess a general definition of catfishing would be when someone poses as someone else or is somehow not being completely truthful about who they are on the internet.
So tell us about ways in which people were gaming it.
Men, particularly cisgender men, gamed reporting features in order to ban people, particularly trans women. And so I would say from like the time that Tinder started to about 2015, 2016, trans women could just be banned out of the app because they would receive a volume of complaints about their profiles being false or being portraying people that they're not supposed to.
Okay.
And this is very particular around like categories. So for instance, there is a large concern, particularly with men on dating apps, to make sure that the people that they're talking to are real cisgender women who are portraying themselves authentically.
Yeah.
And so a lot of systems are in place to support that very particular need by those particular kind of people. And so when trans women are in the mix and they are self-identifying as women and they're mixed in with other women who are cisgender, they were able to sort those women out of the dating pool by using reporting features.
I think what you're saying is that by using those reporting features, they were able to more or less erase trans people from the dating site. I mean, that's what it sounds like.
Yes, that's basically what it is. You couldn't really, so for me, for my personal experience, at least on being reported, is that there would come a time where I was reported and had my profile taken down like at least once a week.
Wow.
And that happened for a good month until eventually my profile just never went back up.
Is it against the site's terms of service to be a trans person on the site, or how does that work?
Tinder is not banning trans women because of their identity, is that Tinder is allowing users to self-police. And that's kind of what I feel like Tinder doesn't seem to understand right now, is that the social effect is this is gender-based discrimination. Tech companies don't understand how they're creating cultures through the design of their products. And that is what Tinder is going to get Tinder, I think, always in trouble with this particular issue.
No, I mean, that sounds kind of reminiscent of the bigger fake news scandal with Facebook, right? Yes. This idea that the platforms just want to be like, oh, we don't curate the content.
Right.
We just
and now
let
they
anybody...
want to make the site.
And then people are just figure out how to take advantage of whatever system they set up.
That's gaming the system. Queer people have been using the internet since the internet to cruise. So it's a very specific kind of internet, if you ask me, right? Tinder and Facebook are very specific, Web 2.0 design ideologies. And so what are those ideologies creating for us? And is all kept up in how people make money off of this. So the reason why this is happening so much is that dating sites have to pander towards cisgender men to make their money.
Right.
Because cisgender men basically make all dating sites go. Because they're the ones who are constantly generating ad revenue, doing the subscriptions, doing all those sorts of things.
Right.
And so essentially, everything kind of panders around that, even though sites try to make it seem like everyone is benefiting from a design for those particular people.
That's so interesting because we have those same conversations about pornography, part of what shapes the character of pornography is the fact that the market is so driven and geared towards the desires of cis men.
Because they're the ones that spend the most amount of money on pornography.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, this is all like so rich. One of the things that you said I thought that was really interesting in your talk in relationship to the desires of cis men vis-a-vis trans women is that you talked about how they almost wanted to be tricked into dating trans women, that was part of the game. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So in my talk, I kind of had like these sort of like 3 acts of catfishing. One was like the first one we were just talking about, which was cisgender men using systems and creating a culture in which catfishes are being eradicated, right? They want to get rid of all people that they believe are catfish away from dating sites, and trans women are automatically included in that because...
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second, actually, before we move on, because I thought what you said about authenticity was really interesting.
Yeah, so like trans people overall are kind of automatically considered catfish on the internet. And this is particularly true for trans women since catfishing is so particularly gendered towards men trying to assess, is this a woman?
Yeah.
Right.
And so because a lot of people don't have enough familiarity and expansiveness with their ideas of just gender, that means that like trans women should not be considered women in the way the categories happen, right?
Right. Yeah. So tell us about Act 2 then.
When the encounter with a trans woman is going to happen, men particularly want to set it up so it seems as much of an excuse as possible, so that trans women who are, you know, there's like this genre of, I would say, porn and like kind of like a pejorative name of the trap, which is like, okay, this person appears to be a beautiful cisgender woman, turns out to be a trans woman, but because she is just so attractive, sex, you know, still happens.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm using generous language, you know, not the language that people who use this term use.
Yeah.
And so this has to do with a follow-up from the first act, which is like men who seek out trans women are discreet. That's like a term,
sure.
You know, in, I guess, cruising circles. I don't know what we call cruising circles, but like just cruising settings where there's discreet people. And more often than not, people who want to seek out trans women in particular are discreet, do not want to be identified as seeking out trans women, and try to do as much as possible to not have a paper trail that they seek out intimacy with trans women. And so there's this sort of, one, eliminating this paper trail, and then 2, when the encounter happens, having this sort of excuse that like, if they are caught or if they are seen with this person, they are passable, they're the most cisgender looking of trans women, and that they could say that they were seduced into it. And that's part of like the fantasy. Like not only can like no trans women, all catfish must not be in public, but then the ones that work the hardest to appear to be cisgender are the ones who are chosen for intimacy, and are very methodically pulled apart from any sort of sense of safety in order for men to have their experience.
When I do phone sex in particular, there's a pattern that emerges there too, where men want to create a particular fantasy, but they don't want to own that. You know, they don't want to own it. They don't want to say that they want it. Instead, they want me to read their minds and then put it out there for them and then like pull it out of them. And then they act surprised that it happened. Right.
Yes.
And so you have to play, you have to play this game, this like kind of mind game. And for me, because it's part of my job, I don't have much of a struggle with that in the sense that I am kind of removed from it. It's just a job. It's kind of a game. But I feel like that must be very different for you. So how do you feel about that sort of game playing?
Yeah, I mean, it sucks. It's stupid. It's essentially what it is just like people cannot be vulnerable in any way, shape, or form. Even when they know that I'm not a sex worker, men tend to approach and treat me like a sex worker, which is as if like I am going to fulfill a whole bunch of functions for them in a very particular way. And there is a part of that is like, I mean, I also partake in like kink and BDSM.
Sure.
And I mostly play with men on the right side of the slash, I guess, the submissive, like, bottom types. And it's really hard to kind of get these people to just say what they want, right? They're very particular. It's like, well, you know what, you know, whatever you want. And I'm like, no, like, that's annoying. Like, stop doing this. So it's just like, I would say this is kind of like a pervasive, I don't know if it's like a heterosexual problem. I don't know. Like, I feel like it's probably a pervasive problem about, like, not being able to talk about sex in general. But in this particular instance, what I will say is I find that most men come to me with sort of like an action item list of like, what is it that they really want? They may or may not be able to tell me upfront what that is. But there is this assumption that I'm going to be fulfilling a certain kind of role. There's a really conscious way of trying to help men through this because they're new and also unwilling to have a support network around this sort of thing.
Right.
So,
yeah, it seems like the fragility of masculinity for like cis men is really a kind of overarching theme here, that all of these different ways of interacting that you're talking about, it seems as though cis men who are seeking interaction with trans women are trying to, at every turn, protect themselves, avoid vulnerability, almost like this obsession. It's like totally risk averse. Everything's about self-protection, and it just seems like that idea of fragility is really central here.
I thought I had to encounter these men on these terms or else I wouldn't have intimacy. And I'm not completely wrong. Unfortunately, I just don't have a lot of intimacy in my life because of this. And that's why I found this like to be a very, important topic to talk about at the conference, because people are talking about masculinity and how it's changing, how it's progressing. Men have all these rainbow of new terms like heteroflexible and like GGG and all these other weird things that I'm just don't really mean anything, in the end of it. But like, who's actually moving men to the left? Who's doing that? And, I quickly started to find out that I was in a network of a bunch of trans women who are isolated from one another, helping then practice not being shitty individuals.
And that was what I thought was so interesting about your talk, or one of the things that was so interesting about your talk. You said so powerfully when you spoke that progress doesn't happen over time, but it happens through labor. And it happens through the labor of people like yourself who are doing this work, but it also happens, I think, through the labor of sex workers who have very similar experiences and who would talk about their interactions with cis men in a really similar way.
Honestly, I feel also what you're communicating and why it resonated so much and why I appreciate it so much is that we have tried to communicate a similar thing to our families and other people in our lives. And many times I've said, like, I feel sex work is a calling. I feel like there's, so much potential good to be done in those personal interactions.
Yeah.
And like, I find I have real difficulty articulating that to people who are outside of it,
who don't have those sort of interactions.
But I really do. I like what you said, talking about how the personal is political in these cases and how there are these networks that are changing attitudes and changing patterns of thought and changing the behavior of cis men one person at a time, and how that is important and how that does add up to real change, and that we shouldn't devalue the labor that people are putting in behind the scenes in those one-on-one interactions, and how that's making a real difference, even if it isn't splashy and big and super visible to everybody.
Yeah, what I've been kind of saying to myself is that I feel like this is an issue of care equity in the sense of who receives care, especially through, intimate. And usually what this is showing, and when we talk more about my purposeful catfishing, I can talk about this a little bit more.
Yeah.
But how much care is often reserved for sexual partners or family members. And so who gets sexual partners gets care. And so if you don't get sexual partners, you do not get care in the society.
Yeah.
And so I think about what you're talking about is when I, get more income, I think one of the first things I'm going to do is like consult sex workers and be like, I have a care equity issue and I know people who can give care work. Is essentially like sex workers, as particular kinds of sex workers,
right,
like escorts or whatever, I mean, cisgender men are kind of like on the bottom of the list of people who need care work. However, I would say that I would prefer the conversation to go is like when I need a lot of care work, so I can therefore pay it forward and do care work for these people.
Is there much of a network? I mean, you talked a little bit about this, of trans women helping to take care of each other.
Well, I would say in general, like queer people know how to take care of queer people.
Sure. Yeah.
The hard part is that my intimacy is often with cisgender men.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. The problem is there's very few queer spaces in which cisgender men are welcome for complicated reasons.
Yes.
But also cisgender men do not seek out to collaborate with those spaces either, right? In healthy ways. Yeah. So the hard part is like, yes, I can be a part of queer communities. I am part of queer communities. Unfortunately, most queer communities, everyone is kind of suffering and broke, right. And so it's kind of like everyone passing around like the draining communal basket,
Right.
So there is support, but the hard part is like there isn't a large amount of energy being put into those communities so they can self-sustain.
Yeah.
And people who are advantaged have that emotional energy way more than people who are like severely disadvantaged. But because of the way that things are structured via identity, for good reasons and other complicated reasons, it's hard to get the wealth of emotional energy from like cisgender men into queer communities.
Right.
And also for me to like, let's say, practice being with cisgender men in any way in a queer friendly space. So I think there's a lot of layers to that. And I think that spreads also kind of to like BDSM and kink communities as well.
Yeah, it seems to me like one of the things that's hard about that, and this is the experience that I've had in queer communities too, is kind of a pushback as to why we should care about cisgender men at all, or even
right.
put any energy into relationships with them of any sort, actually. And I think that there's something that's actually like damaging about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's separatism, right? Like that's like leftover sentiment from like lesbian separatism that people still use now. And let me tell you, the people who are separatists are, mostly white cis women who are kind of like, let's fuck everyone off, or other people who easily have emotional care in those systems. So there's, I would say the majority of trans women I know personally, as a personal anecdote, are queer and do not date men. Or do not get the vast majority of their intimacy from men. Mm-hmm. So in a way, like I'm an outlier, and there isn't a lot of support because the way that trans women who seek intimacy from men are structured almost completely through sex work. That's like the directional way of any sort of support would be. And since I'm not a sex worker in the official sense, like I'm not a sex worker. I do sex work, but I'm not a sex worker.
Right, I got you.
That I don't get that support.
We haven't talked about the third act yet. We should jump into that.
Okay, cool. So the third act is I made a catfishing profile, but I decided the reason why I would do it is because dating apps don't work for me. Like if I'm seeking intimacy, then dating apps are antagonistic towards that end for me. And so I had to look at dating apps as something different. Like social media overall, I feel like they're all entertainment. And so I decided to view it as entertainment, but try to do it with good because I do create art and stuff and like somewhat entertainment context. And I try to have a bend with social activism in it. So I have a catfish profile now on purpose where I basically just copied and pasted all of my now banned profiles over into this, profile that shows a white cis woman. And I talk with people on these apps, and often I talk to them about like, what is a new masculinity? What is sex positivity? What is, sex advice? How do you feel about like BDSM and kink and like all these sorts of things? And because I appear as this white cis woman, people actually approach me and talk to me. And it's a wild experience that has like been like really interesting for me personally because of that.
Yeah, one of the things that you said in your talk is that you actually didn't know that men could be so nice until you appeared as a white cis woman, which was really striking. I was like, oh my God.
But it's really true. It's like I've never experienced men be so kind, and I've never experienced men be just so emphatically interested in my soul. It's just been like, there's obviously a very dismal side of that, you know,
right.
It's like when I do authentically, air quote, authentically show myself, I don't receive that. But it does show to me, because there's a lot of ethics issues around me being a catfish.
Yeah.
But my counter to that is when I'm put into this situation in which literally cannot receive care because of the way that social discrimination happens in systems and are perpetuated by these apps, being a catfish is like the only way for me to actually have connection with men, even though they're extremely short-lived. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like, I gain a small amount of hope with these sorts of conversations. Like, guys are not really bad. There's good ones out there and they know how to work. But I do feel compelled to kind of be in this sort of mode. And all of my dating apps now are just my catfish profile.
I used to work a corporate job where I was the only woman in the office. And before that, I was in academia where I was like one of the only women in the department. And in those environments that are like very masculine and which don't include sexual intimacy, in which men respond to me in the way that they do to people who they either want to have sex with or have some sort of like sexual intimacy with, I found that there was a lot of very blatant racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia that I had no power to stand up against because I was completely discounted in all of those situations. But then when I moved into doing online sex work, in which now the relationship has turned and it's sort of a one-on-one like intimacy, I found that actually when those conversations turned to be something that I was uncomfortable with, I suddenly had like a political platform to change minds in ways that was so much more powerful than what I ever had in academia or in corporate America. And I found that to be actually really interesting, that there's a way in those sort of intimate interactions that you have so much more say, so much more power, and so much more leverage than you do in other environments.
I totally agree. If it wasn't for a bunch of factors, I would say like because of my experiences, I was like, man, I really should do this for a living. Like, I'm really good at this, like I'm really good at helping people through like these very intense moments of their lives. And also just be like, hey, what you're doing and saying is like not good. Like, give me the terms, let me just like get you right. Because in that time, especially when they know that you're seeing them as a human being, people are receptive, especially when sex is about to be involved, right? They're kind of like, okay, I'm going to learn this sort of thing. So there's a weird function in place that this facilitates.
Yeah, when you're like, I'll play with your fantasy, but I can't talk about bodies in the way that you're talking about bodies. You need to use these particular sorts of words, or especially around like race and gender, because cis white men are really bad usually at talking about race and gender, but they have these like very intense fantasies that they want to play out. And it's in that space that you can say, hey, we can do this, but the way that this needs to look is this way. And then there's moments where they're like, oh, okay, yeah. And that's actually really interesting. Those sort of like educational moments in which they change the way that they're talking about people. And I don't see that happening outside of intimate interactions, actually.
Yeah. The turn that my work has been going is that like, we really value public displays of activism. We believe that like what is change is kind of like what is done in the streets, like kind of what is done in public. But there's so much that needs to be done in like our bedrooms and our kitchens and our living rooms. There's so much. How you treat like the people in your life is probably the foundation of how you're going to treat and value the world at large.
Absolutely.
And so like if you're unable to unpack the power dynamics and be able to negotiate and go through in a healthy way the people who you're most close to, like how do you expect to conceptualize that for anything else? And so I find that is what this is very interesting about what we're talking about right now, is that very like intentional intimacy is a space for practicing and developing new cultural behaviors.
Where can people find your art or your work or what you're up to?
Yeah, so I tweet as Thought Couture with X in the middle of Thought and Couture. I have a website, mattiebrice.com. And I feel like finding me at fun conventions and things like Theorizing the Web is usually a good way to run into me and talk to me.
Yeah, it was really great to meet you there. And I'm really glad you were on my panel. And I'm glad that you agreed to chat with us on the podcast.
Of course, I had a fun time.
So thanks so much.
Of course.
We are here with Lindsay Ferris, who is a researcher who has experience within the tech of social space, aiding nonprofits in the implementation of responsible and strategic technology data practices. She currently works at Ad Hoc, where she is working to make government technologies inclusive to all Americans, and recently graduated with a master's degree from the Oxford Internet Institute. So welcome, Lindsay.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
You were on my panel at Theorizing the Web, and I thought you gave a really good presentation on queer dating and the way that women often queer dating apps. So we wanted to talk to you a little bit about that for the show. Can you just give a brief overview of your talk?
Yeah, so I spoke a little about some research that I did at Oxford. And basically, I wanted to explore the way, as you put it quite well, the way that women were queering their tech up, particularly around mobile dating apps.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of the times, these devices or programs are not built with them in mind. And so a lot of the design features end up being alienating and problematic for these women. So I wanted to explore the way that they were figuring out how to repurpose them.
Yeah, so let's talk first about how design features seem alien to a lot of women who are using it, particularly queer women who are using it.
Well, I think that there are pretty rigid choices around sexuality, your preferences of who you would want to be seeking to date, and also like how you identify yourself. And there is the feature to kind of swipe from one to the other, which can be, it's kind of interesting because it ends up being a little bit of a double-edged sword, because you can switch to say, okay, I'm female who's interested in pursuing women, which on the one hand, you could switch between those, which it seems that it would allow for a lot of fluidity.
Yeah.
At the same time, the gender options are super limiting, first of all. There was perceptions that people just kind of made those choices somewhat arbitrarily or ephemerally, which led to people feeling like they were constantly being intruded by other people that didn't feel like belonged in that part of the app.
So what you mean is that female identified people would then say that they're interested in dating other women, but the perception would be that they're there for all sorts of reasons. And so they were either being pursued by people who they didn't say that they were interested in, or they were being pursued by the people who they did think they were interested in, but those people weren't looking for romantic or sexual connections.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
I mean, it gets at this idea also of the fact that it's such a limited context in which you're seeing somebody's profile, kind of the full range of who they might be or what kind of relationship they might be interested in, or how they might in their full self identify as, or, you know, who they've seen in the past, who they want to continue seeing, and also like things that just happen when you meet somebody. All of those things can't be captured in just really a picture.
Right.
Given the way that also the features really encourage people to swipe through quickly, there's really not enough context to understand why someone might be on there and who they might be.
That's actually what I hate about Tinder and what happened to OkCupid when it tenderized.
Everything is Tinderized.
I know, and I hate it.
So I guess is what happens then, is it that people kind of project their own assumptions onto the people they're looking through, and then when they go to interact with them, come to find that they're not in fact looking for the same thing? Or like, what's the conflict that plays out in practice then?
It plays out in a lot of different ways. So I think that the example you just imagined, lots of the participants I talked to had experienced that. So I talked to folks that because of having experienced something like what you described, ended up, projecting what they believed somebody would be, and based on just that picture, and also would start to really internalize who should belong in this space and who shouldn't belong in this space based on that model that they had in their head. Often these models corresponded with stereotypes. And also, as a result, I think people would try to put out those stereotypes as well about themselves, so that they belonged. But at the same time, there's a difference between what people said they did and then also like what they did, as like they actually did, as you can imagine. And so you would see also like the people I interviewed, even though they had this like super rigid idea of who should be here and what signals show that you're like legitimate in this space, they wouldn't always adhere to those themselves. They would switch through whenever they felt like it, like between like all the different options or who they could be looking at. Or they would also like present themselves in a way that was not corresponding with kind of the mental model, but like still look for that in others and justify why they presented themselves as particularly femme.
Yeah, so let's go back to that for a second. What was the stereotype of who belonged in those spaces?
Yeah, there's definitely like a quintessential lesbian identity.
Yeah.
There were a lot of plays on particular parts of lesbian culture that you kind of had to have a pretty limited purview to understand. So it in some ways does operate as this hetero space that you have to find each other within. So it definitely like had a lot of utility in that way as a way for people to screen other folks rather than feeling these kind of invasions were pretty real and traumatizing to women that I spoke to. So they had to mitigate against that threat somehow.
So what did they find more traumatizing or more invasive? Straight men or women who they didn't deem to be lesbian enough? Or what was the thing that was more upsetting?
I think that there was a lot of the deception that they felt on the part of couples and men that they perceived were cis straight men. Also, that was kind of, they felt really was a breach and wanted to protect against that specifically and actually kind of thought Tinder should do more to make that happen.
How did people feel like they were being deceived by couples? What was their feeling about couples who were using Tinder?
I think people felt deceived when they had instances where they felt that they put the woman in the first picture. Yeah. And again, kind of manipulate this idea that you'll just swipe really quickly. So then they would get kind of bombarded with messages later that like sexual advances that they weren't interested in.
Yeah.
So these are couples looking for like a threesome or something.
Yeah. Also, people that didn't feel necessarily deceived by that scenario I described also maybe felt like it wasn't perhaps the space for people to do that, which I thought was really interesting, actually, and made me rethink some of my Tinder practices.
But it's also kind of ironic because at the same time, this group of people is also identifying a subgroup of Tinder as gay Tinder, in which they're clearly trying to use Tinder
like against the grain.
I mean,
but then they're like, other people can't use it against the grain. There's a function for Tinder.
Yeah.
It's not
absolutely.
that.
It just seems interesting that the way that this policing works, which, I mean, it's not that I'm not sympathetic to people wanting to have, a safe space to potential partners and not be harassed by other people. Of course, I'm sympathetic to that. But at the same time, the way we police these different boundaries and different people's competing interests, I think, is interesting, especially when you have so many disparate people all crammed into the same app, right? Like gay men have Grindr, and then it's like Tinder for everybody else. And I think that's interesting in and of itself. Like, how did that come to be?
No, I think it's and I think that's funny because in some ways the response is like, oh, should everyone just have their own place, right? Should everyone have their own app? It doesn't really work that way for a lot of reasons. But like, I did ask women a lot, what about something like her or other places? A lot of them said that just the critical mass of people on Tinder was just like unparalleled.
I wonder, though, how limiting that is for people who have more fluid identities and more fluid sexualities as well. Yeah. Like, what if you don't want to go to her because, you're bisexual? It almost seems that segregating out all of those different interests would also reify categories in a way that won't work for some people.
Yeah.
So I have a question about the technology aspect of this. So Tinder's an app, and so there's certain like affordances in an app that I think, or limitations of them in an app that I think are different on a website. So something like OkCupid that was more of a website before it was an app. It seems to me like there was more space there for people to really express like who they are and what they're looking for in a much more expansive way than Tinder. And I wonder if that has something to do with the interface and the way that you like interact with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the things that we talked about like really having very little space to talk about yourself or even talk about why you're on it, right?
Right.
People would say, they would see somebody that they knew that was like in a relationship
Yeah.
And not really have a lot of context about why that person was on there.
Sure.
And you don't know like the actual inner workings of their relationship, you know, like you don't know if they're in an open relationship or even if they're like maybe not even in a relationship anymore. Or also Tinder keeps people's profiles in there forever, even if they haven't been active. So there's no way to know why they're there. And that adds like an interesting element. And that also ties into this geospatial component.
Yeah.
I mean, Tinder shows you everyone around you. So depending on where you live, that has a significant impact on how public the space feels.
Yeah. And one of the things that you talked about that I thought was particularly interesting was the way that it pushed a certain lesbian identity or a certain like way of being a lesbian that called into question other presentations or other ways. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think particularly like this kind of ongoing butch femme dynamic.
Yeah.
Which has definitely, you know, there's been a lot of literature and work on like the desirability of femme bodies, but also this identifying factor of being ultra butch or butch looking. So that, I think that was like really played out. And one of the women I interviewed was particularly femme and also like was very like, I believe that I'm making a political statement by dressing and acting in this way. And I had to actually like spend a lot of time curating and changing her profile around to like having to defend herself over and over again.
Yeah. Wow. I feel like that outside of dating apps, I think that there's something about queer culture in general that puts femme presenting people on the defense.
Yeah. I think that that's definitely what these people experienced. That they would have to, first it was like, I have to convince people that I am not straight.
Yeah.
And then I have to convince them that I'm not bi. And there's something around that invalidates you by being bi versus like a gold star lesbian, I guess.
Right.
That it's a really tricky space.
Yeah, it's interesting that so much identity performance has to go into an app whose affordances are so limited, right? Like that's sort of, to me, the kind of profound irony is that there is actually so little capacity that you have to express your identity on Tinder, and yet there's so much identity that it demands that you express in order to fit within these different, I guess, dating pools.
Yeah. It's actually interesting that you mentioned that because, Jesse, you were saying earlier, just like this Tinderization of OkCupid. It's just, it's becoming kind of a much more popular and pervasive way compared to these online sites that have been around for much longer, that I'd be curious to know. I think that there's definitely like a corporate structural element to that. Like there is an enforcement of that upon people to some extent. And also it facilitates these quick connections. It captures like a larger market because of the low lift that it is for people to kind of get on it.
I was actually just thinking that probably one of the reasons that Tinder has so many people on it is because the barrier to entry is like really low. So I'm a writer, and so I liked OkCupid because I want to go through, put together some sort of narrative about who I am and my identity and what I'm doing there. And that's fun to me, and I like to read other people's things. But there's a lot of people who don't like that.
And I think it's a platform for everyone and no one as a result, too.
Where can people find your work if they're interested in it?
You can follow me on Twitter at Lindsay with an AY _Joelle, JOELLE. That's the best way to contact me. I'm reworking my personal website, so I will post a link on Twitter once it is up.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it was really good to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for organizing the panel and inviting me on the show.
Thank you all so much for hanging out with us. You can find Kelly Steinmetz on Twitter at Kelly Jasmine, Mattie Brice at ThoughtXCouture, and Lindsay Ferris at Lindsay with an A _Joelle. I'm PJ Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at PeachSage.
And I'm Jessie Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at SapioTextual.
We would like to remind you that we have a Patreon account and would appreciate your support. Please visit patreon.com/peepshowpodcast. Thanks to Joe Kennedy for the music. The show was produced by Jesse and PJ Sage. Signing off. Have a great week.